In my last video, I covered the monumental site of Persepolis, which was the great ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Achaemenids were the first great Persian imperial dynasty. They ruled a massive empire stretching from Egypt to Central Asia, and they had several capitals, not just one. In this video, I'm going to talk about Susa, the administrative capital where the day-to-day running of the empire took place. Unlike Persepolis, which was more of a palatial complex, Susa was a very large city on its own with a large local population. And also unlike Persepolis, which was built and founded by the Persians, Susa was already a very ancient city by the time the Persians took it. It was originally an Elamite city, belonging to a civilization as old as the first Sumerian cities. So really, Susa is one of the oldest cities in human history. Elam was on the edge of Mesopotamia, and was culturally much closer to the Mesopotamian world than to the Persian culture of the Iranian highlands. Susa was conquered by Cyrus the Great during the rise of the Persian Empire in the mid-6th century BC. After Cyrus's conquest, the Persians developed it into one of the capitals of the empire. Because of its location right between all the major population centers of Mesopotamia to the west and the Iranian plateau to the east, it was in a better position to serve as a functioning capital. It was easier to reach and communicate with, and so better positioned for administration. And because its climate was warmer than the Iranian highlands, it became the winter capital for the Persian kings, who spent long periods of time there. In many ways, Susa was the main capital of the Persian Empire. Darius I was the third Achaemenid king, and he initiated some of the empire's largest building projects. Between 520 and 515 BC, he transformed Susa into one of the great capitals of the empire by building a massive royal complex. The complex included palaces, administrative rooms, courtyards, monumental gateways, and a huge audience hall known as the Apadana, which was very similar to the later Apadana in Persepolis. These reconstructions are not just random guesses. They're based on archaeological remains found on the ground, archaeological reports, the positions and identification of buildings, knowledge of Persian architecture from other sites, and the actual topography of the place. The Apadana at Susa was almost the exact same dimensions as the one at Persepolis, and both were built by Darius. These are reconstructions of the Apadana at Persepolis, but we can use them to imagine what the Apadana at Susa would have looked like. It was a massive audience hall, with a forest of towering columns over 20 meters high, and at the top were capitals in the shape of double bull heads. Some of those double bull capitals can be seen in the Susa Museum and in the Louvre. We can see how similar in scale the two Apadanas were on Google Maps. They're both about 70 meters from edge to edge on the inner court, and just over 100 meters for the outer perimeter, with the one at Persepolis being slightly larger. The palace complex in general likely served as the model for Persepolis, as it was built slightly earlier, and a lot of the architectural elements repeat themselves, like the double bull capitals. It was built on a massive artificial platform about 15 meters high, and separated from the rest of the city by a large moat. You can also see the remains of the moat today on Google Maps. Inscriptions found at Susa contain detailed descriptions by Darius I of where the building materials and craftsmen came from. He hired craftsmen from all over the empire for their specialized skills. The Achaemenids themselves rose to power fairly quickly from a more tribal background to an imperial superpower, so they didn't come from that long architectural traditions as some of the older civilizations like the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. Therefore, for their royal projects, they drew on talent, artistic styles, and materials from across the empire. In these inscriptions, Darius seems to be showing off the scale of his power, the fact that he could mobilize international craftsmen and expensive materials from huge distances into a single royal project. The inscriptions were written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, which reflects the multilingual nature of the empire and Susa's position between Persian Iran and the older Mesopotamian world. Today, the archaeological site at Susa is underwhelming and frankly unimpressive, much less visually striking than Persepolis. In many ways, it mostly looks like a field of dried mud. This is largely because much of the city was built using mud brick, an ancient building tradition in Mesopotamia that goes back to the very first cities. Over the centuries, rain and wind gradually eroded these mud brick structures, which is why parts of the site almost look melted into the landscape. It's like this ancient city built with mud is slowly merging back into the earth. Most of what survives today consists of foundations, low walls, mounds, fragments of palace structures, and column bases, including the remains of the Apadana. Compare that with Persepolis, which even in its ruined state still preserves far more stunning architecture because so much of it was built with stone. Interestingly, far fewer administrative tablets were found in Susa than at Persepolis, which is ironic because it probably contained a much larger archive. At Persepolis, thousands of clay tablets survived because the site was burned by Alexander the Great. The fire accidentally baked and hardened these clay tablets, preserving them for archaeologists thousands of years later. Since many archives in the ancient Near East were written on unfired clay tablets, it's possible that large amounts of inscriptions at Susa simply eroded away over time, unlike the accidentally baked tablets at Persepolis. The Mesopotamian influence at Susa can be clearly seen in the brightly colored glazed brick decorations that once covered parts of the palace walls. These were strongly influenced by older Babylonian traditions. One look at the Ishtar Gate from Babylon helps show the similarity. These glazed decorations from the Palace of Darius include floral and geometric designs, lions, mythical creatures, religious imagery associated with the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda, and most famously, the archers. These archers likely represent the king's elite guard, known as the Immortals, who served both the soldiers in the army and as palace guards. Depictions of these guards also appear at Persepolis, although there they appear as carved stone reliefs rather than glazed brick decoration. In antiquity, those reliefs were also originally painted in bright colors. Different minerals were used for the colors in the bricks, while the glaze itself melted during firing into a hard glass-like coating that protected the decoration and gave it a bright reflective finish. This glazing technique was already highly developed in Babylon and was later adopted by the Persians, who drew artistic traditions from many different cultures and synthesized them into a distinctly Persian imperial style. In fact, these glazed brick decorations at Susa were most likely made by Babylonian artisans under Persian direction, as suggested by the inscriptions where Darius lists the artisans who work for him. Susa was the eastern terminus of the Royal Road, the imperial highway connecting it to Sardis in western Anatolia. The route stretched roughly 2,500 kilometers across the western half of the empire. Herodotus claimed that royal messengers could travel the entire royal road in about 9 days using relay stations and fresh horses. Whether or not that 9-day figure is accurate or exaggerated, the point is that Susa was plugged into one of the fastest communication networks in the ancient world. Susa therefore received a constant flow of messengers, officials, ambassadors, craftsmen, merchants, and materials from across the empire. This likely made it one of the most cosmopolitan and internationally connected cities in the Persian world. Compared to Persepolis, which was used more for royal ceremonies and festivals like Nowruz, Susa functioned more as a working capital where decrees were issued and much of the day-to-day business of running an empire took place. Susa also appears in the Book of Esther, which is the basis of the Jewish holiday Purim. It's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as Shushan, and today the modern city is called Shush, so it still preserves the ancient name. The story is set in the palace of the Persian king, usually identified as Xerxes I, who was the same Persian king that almost conquered Greece. The Book of Esther gives a vivid description of the royal court at Susa, filled with palace ceremony, luxury, banquets, and court politics. The story also reflects the presence of a Jewish community within the Persian Empire as early as the 5th century BC. In the story, Esther, a Jewish woman, becomes queen, while her uncle Mordechai is portrayed as a court official. Whether fully historical or partly legendary, the narrative reflects a Persian imperial world in which Jewish communities were already established and integrated enough to appear in stories about Persian court life. It also suggests a society in which minority communities could potentially rise to positions of power within the court. That community originated a century earlier, after the Neo-Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC and deported much of the population into exile within their empire. Later, after Cyrus the Great conquered the Neo-Babylonians, he allowed many exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. Many Jews returned to Judah, but many also remained throughout Mesopotamia and the Persian Empire, and the Book of Esther reflects that continuing diaspora community. Iran itself would remain home to a major Jewish community for many centuries afterward. and still has a sizable Jewish population today, whose roots likely trace back to these ancient communities. So to sum up, Susa's warmer climate, lower elevation, and position closer to the major population centers of Mesopotamia made it more practical than Persepolis as a functioning capital, and probably more comfortable for the Persian kings as they spent long periods of time there. And unlike Persepolis, which was founded by the Persians, Susa was a much older city, and a cultural hybrid shaped by Persian, Elamite, and Mesopotamian influences. In some ways, it may actually have been the least Persian in character out of the major Achaemenid capitals, but administratively, it was the most important one. If you'd like to learn more about Persepolis itself, I made an entire documentary about the site and how Alexander the Great eventually destroyed it. And if you've enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. My name is Jordan, and thank you for watching.